we're down to the last 2 weeks. Where has this semester gone? Okay. As I just messaged you, just a reminder, your videos are due. Already seeing some being uploaded and looking forward to seeing them. Okay. Just a reminder, those of you who are a little bit shy, there is no need to have your name explicitly in the video. And through the very simple mechanism of making a sub-channel on YouTube, super easy to do. There are lots of YouTube videos about making sub-channels on YouTube, like there are on anything, okay? You can very easily hide the connection between your video and your own Google ID. That's if you actually used your own name with Google. As I did, because I got a Google account many, many years ago, and I was able to get Picaria@gmail.com. So I was kind of jumped on that. That means also my username is Picaria. Although you can actually mask that, but I don't bother. Because academics are out there in the world very publicly and prominently anyway. They're probably the easiest people to kill if you decide to, because they're so easy to find. There is no kind of notion of privacy with academics. By the way, actually, some of you may know about Salman Rushdie, who's a very famous author in the 80s, wrote a book, The Satanic Verses, which was controversial, quite controversial in the Islamic world. And the Iranian regime, theocratic regime, put a fatwa out, a order for his assassination. And that's never happened. However, his Japanese translator, who translated the Satanic Verses into Japanese and was a professor at Tsukuba University, he was assassinated, and they never caught the killer. Also, a professor at Meiji University was stabbed to death by a grumpy ex-zemisei of his. Apparently stabbed him about 50 times when he went to the bathroom. So, I hope I haven't annoyed you this semester, but the broader point there is professors are kind of out there in the world. We just kind of live with that. There is a certain self-discipline involved in that, actually. You're a little bit more careful about what you say to people and the public persona you take on. But for those of you who really are worried about privacy issues, there's several layers of which you can distance yourself from, of course, your video. That's all leading up to, please, no one else, 2 people have, no one else asked me to not put their video on the playlist because maybe they're either uncomfortable with the quality of their production or for some other reason, such as copyright issues or permissions or something like that. All of these things have been very clear cut from the beginning. So your content must be able to go up on YouTube, not trigger an automatic YouTube user violation policy, which means most importantly, be very careful of soundtracks. If you are putting music into your video, then make sure you do get something that is copyright free, and there are plenty of things. And I saw a very nice post on the forum. Finally, I want to thank everyone for the really high quality of the posts there. Some of you have been just fantastic in terms of sharing very generously some great bits of advice. And I replied to a few of them. As you all know, though, the Moodle interface is just a nightmare. Something in the forums is not quite working with the when you go to reply to things. I found there is a workaround. You actually have to refresh the page and actually to click on the link and then to be able to post to it. And then if you've done that once, you can't open the next link. Then you've got to refresh the page. So because I also get emails of all the posts, I have been reading the posts directly through the emails, but I can't reply to them through my email. So I do want to go through and for some of the particularly spot on, very generous posts, I do want to thank people in person, virtually. But it's a big shout out, to everybody who's been very, very generous in sharing there. And I'm absolutely determined that everyone will get recognition for that. I think collectively, there has been a huge amount of very positive sharing of know-how. We have had a lot of shares in terms of some of the complex technical issues. A lot of it, though, those issues, it's more just familiarity more than anything else. That once you're actually alert to all the things that can go wrong, you know, things like most people don't think of this. Actually, whether, you know, in Tokyo and Osaka, 50 megahertz, 60 megahertz, the electricity, and that means that actually lights that look like they're constantly on, everything is always flickering. So if you're really unlucky and you've chosen a frames per second setting, and if you're using a camera as well that's got control of a shutter speed, not your phone doesn't, but if you choose a shutter speed and a frames per second setting, that doesn't go well with the hertz of the place you're in, you get this horrible kind of flickering effect when you're shooting by artificial light. So if any of you have had that problem, it's actually very difficult to fix unless you pay for some kind of expensive apps that actually can fix it really, really well. But for the most part, you can get away with it, particularly because the things like if you're using your iPhone, for example, they have Apple's been very alert to those kind of problems, and so they tend to use a slow shutter speed, which is kind of behind the interface. You don't really have control over it. Although if you use alternative apps, you do, and so you don't realize that those problems can arise. So in a funny kind of way, when you venture out a little bit more technically, you discover more of the problems, but that's part of the learning process. And you know, as a translation of the Japanese expression, you know, failure is the foundation of success. I don't know if it's the foundation of success. It's certainly the foundation of learning. I think it's shippai wa chishiki no moto, maybe. At least you learn. It doesn't necessarily mean you succeed in the short term. There's another Japanese expression, nanakorobi yaoki seiko. So you fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. It's actually a Chinese Buddhist expression into Japanese. Although I've been looking to collaborate with a graphic designer to make a t-shirt for snowboarders that say yakorobi nanoki shibo. You fall down 8 times, get up 7 times, you're dead, and have a picture of a snowboarder wrapped around a tree or something like that. So that's one of my little projects. The final one I mentioned earlier in the course, very famously Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia, who unified Germany, very famously said that many people say, learn from your mistakes. He said, I prefer to learn from other people's mistakes. That's why what is so good about YouTube, that actually, if you do get into binge watching YouTube videos, how to do videos, you can see how a whole lot of people make mistakes before you've even made them yourselves. And one of the most striking things in terms of thumbnails, samaneru, it sounds so completely in Japanese, samaneru. My young son was telling me that I wasn't going to get many views on my YouTube channel because my samaneru wasn't very good. I'm like, samaneru. No, sleep coldly. And then I realized he was talking thumbnail. Okay. So the thumbnails weren't very cool. And I told him, no, I've got a forced audience. I don't actually have to go viral, which I'm about to talk to in a moment. But one of the really striking things, if you do look at videos that have had very successful thumbnails that generate a lot of views in how to do it space, a significant proportion of them have this message, you know, like the 8 mistakes or the 9 mistakes or the 5 mistakes that beginners make kind of thing. Because everyone in any field wants to get out of beginner category. Who wants to be Shoshinsha? You know, everyone's trying to get out of the beginner category as quickly as possible, so that if you are offering a value proposition in terms of being able to fast track your advancement to intermediate status, it's going to generate a huge potential buzz. Okay. Now, speaking of buzz, let's turn to getting attention. Before we do that, I think plenty of time has elapsed now. We're pretty much on the hour. We have 80 participants, so I know a couple of folks are in terrible time zones and they don't join us regularly. This is the kind of the regular 80. We've stabilized around this number. So could everyone just simply, like I'm about to do, put 11 in chat? Okay. And that gives me a wonderful sense of who is here and actually paying attention, okay? Because some people can just log in and then go off and, I don't know, play computer games or something like that. Okay, right. So I'm going to go straight over to the screen share attention. So you're going to see talking slides. By the way, I know I've been doing this quite a lot, but I actually am a little bit allergic to the whole model of talking slides. And right at the beginning of the semester, when we did this COVID communications discussion about Waseda, one of the things that Waseda used to justify not having given you guys a discount, or your parents a discount, was that Waseda had invested in all this expensive software. Well, first of all, Moodle is actually open source, although we did pay a lot for the vendors to install it. But the other two bits of software they referred to were two Korean bits of software, actually. Unfortunately, not used in any English-speaking country. So unlike Moodle, any Googling on how to use it only gives Hangul tips, which has been a bit of a problem for some of my colleagues. But some of you immediately recognize those faculty members who've been using video lek, because you can see that you get slides and you get this little virtual kind of control panel down in the corner and this little floating head of the professor bobbing around. I am waiting for someone to do a nice parody on that, like a first-person shooter game, you know, where that professor's head bobs around and you get to shoot it and explode professors' heads. Okay, so we're going to talk about earning attention. Attention. Okay. Of course, the culture of attention, arguably we are living in an ever more narcissistic age. I'm not entirely convinced of that, though. I just think the forms of the ways in which people try and get attention have simply changed. Yeah, you'll still see some hooligans, Bozozoku Yankee. Yeah. Sometimes you go out into the back blocks of Japan and there are still people revving motorbikes late at night, you know, having cut the baffles out of the exhaust pipe or doing burners in hotted out cars. To my mind, it's so 1980s, but anyway. So there are always people drawing attention to themselves in some way or another. And in a funny kind of way, just drawing attention to yourself in social media is probably far less socially damaging than the kind of behaviors I used to routinely see when I was a teenager. Stupid acts of vandalism of public spaces, private property, blowing things up because people were bored and wanted to get attention. There's a great line in a Eminem song, which is very early 2000s too, which is something to the effect of, I'm in trouble with the government, I'm loving it. And he goes on to say that you're telling me that I'm being a social menace. Fantastic, keep telling me, I'll up my efforts. Because the whole point there is a lot of people are behaving badly precisely because they want to get some attention. Because maybe their parents ignore them, everybody ignores them. And the only thing worse than being good is being ignored. And so a lot of people would prefer to be bad to get attention. Okay, but we want to talk in business terms here. And I'm going to, I wonder about this. Actually, this is something I put together from last year's class, because last year I actually had to take a week off in the middle of the course. I had no class one week because I had to go to Tel Aviv to give a presentation for the launching of the Israeli Cultural Diplomacy and Place Banding Forum. There's a guest speaker there. And if any of you have been to Tel Aviv, you'll know that it's a very vibrant liberal city right on the beach in the Mediterranean, very affluent place. And people talk about the Tel Aviv bubble. There's so much going on in Israel and in political dynamics and security dynamics, but Tel Aviv is just this wonderful bubble where it's simultaneously very intellectual, but also super relaxed. It's kind of like the Gold Coast in Australia, mixed with the best bits of Sydney, mixed with some of the best parts of the Lower East Side of New York, for example. So particularly in the spring and summer, Tel Aviv, huge numbers of hotels, but also huge numbers of tourists coming from Europe, but also particularly large numbers of Jewish Americans coming to visit Israel. So obviously, huge number of properties. This is when you go looking into the map function through the map function booking.com, all the properties show up, as you can see here. And the ones that are colored in red are the ones that are currently not available for the dates that you're looking at. And particularly if you know where you're going, you know exactly where you want to be, this is one of the very best ways, because you hover over each and you get to see the price. So, yeah, there is this kind of challenge to stand out in a crowded market. I personally have more of an interest in little boutique hotels rather than the big chains, although there's sometimes more reliability in the quality and the service. So using the crowdsourced reviews is absolutely vital if you're going to use those boutique ones. This is a cool one that I stayed in last time. Okay. And this is the Dave West. The hotel is, there's a series of them, founded by a guy called David, or calls himself Dave. And Dave is quintessential Brooklyn-esque kind of hipster beards and caps and skinnies, although skinnies are now kind of out again, especially with lockdown. Who wants to wear skinnies? Circulation is cut off in all the wrong places. But still hipster shirts and singlets are on trend. So we see here, of course, nice points of differentiation in terms of the found objects that I mentioned in the last class, very boutique aesthetics, and clever use of text with an antique retro sensibility. I knew my dad, being of a certain generation, absolutely would not get it. So this little picture of this sideboard here, this bedside table, all kind of rusty and beat up. I absolutely loved it. I love the patina. It's a kind of a Western wabi-sabi in a way. I sent it to my dad because I knew that he would think that's ludicrous because he's so off trend. And my mum, on the other hand, would get it and would be quite amused that dad wouldn't get it. So, of course, you're just near the beach and whatnot. And again, so rusty items are actually kind of cool items. By the way, all through the Mediterranean, and particularly in places like Israel or Greece, from about mid-April until mid-September, it never rains. Like literally not a cloud in the sky for months. And so personally, I find Tsuyu quite difficult to bear. My kind of dream world is that we move towards quarters or online teaching just for the second half of spring. And I'm allowed to relocate to either the Gold Coast in Australia, which is winter but crystal clear, or a place like Tel Aviv or a Greek island, and come to students from under blue skies every single day. That, of course, has not happened. However, those of you in my Zemi know that one of my Zemisei who could not travel from Latvia back to Japan, but Latvia being a low COVID-19 environment, went to an equally low COVID environment of Greece last week. So she joined our Zemi from Santorini under grand blue skies. Okay, well, in terms of getting attention, what are the changes? We all understand. We're working on it right now, all the videos you're doing, for example, okay? Basic technological change, and then there's a whole bunch of social changes that have been associated around with that, okay? And particularly modern information communication technologies. And it's not just that we have the technologies to connect, but this has enabled dramatic changes in business models, and particularly the provision of these free social media platforms that make sense as businesses because the attention that people give to them can be monetized. So it's really about monetizing the attention. And that reading that I gave you in the very first week, a book chapter of mine that just came out literally a week before this course started, I talked very specifically in the introduction about those kind of developments. You have lots of social changes, and we do see that governments every now and again recognize that, oh, maybe we need to do something. Maybe we need to get with globalization. Maybe we need to get with social media, for example. From a communications perspective, a lot of it becomes quite tokenistic. This is just very nuzzle to me, bus stop signs here in Tokyo, which were suddenly going to be all very cosmopolitan because foreigners now come to Japan. Of course, you get Josenji Temple. G is temple, so you don't really need to put temple kind of in the first place, okay? But maybe difficult to translate. And then they got super lazy, decided to have a few other kind of token languages there. I don't know why they decided to settle upon focusing on Malaysian tourists and Danish tourists. I'm not sure why Danes are not Swedes. A Danish mate of mine thought this is hilarious. But he did say, "Why not the Icelanders?" You know, it's kind of, it makes as much kind of logic. Okay, but of course the spelling is off, even though they've got a Danish flag. Temple in Danish is TMPEL. Okay. And sorry, in Malay, I once studied Malay many years ago because Malaysia was the first place I ever spent time in, but unfortunately forgot it. But as I've got down the bottom there, according to Google Translate, temple ain't temple in Malay. So the technological change, really obvious, okay, ubiquitous connectivity, social media platforms, digitization of media content, and the fact that all of this can be accessed for free is just astonishing. And not just for free, of course, that there are opportunities to monetize this. And those of you who have already played with your YouTube settings, when you go into your controls there, you can see that there are a whole bunch of menus for choosing your monetization options. So I would be delighted if some of you, having done this project, thought, actually, this is kind of fun. And I've got some ideas about content, and go on to be super successful, highly monetized YouTubers. An anecdote from years ago, there was actually an Italian exchange student in SILS who kind of accidentally found himself being contacted by Google about monetizing his video. And he'd shot a video when he was just hanging out with some Japanese friends from SILS, and he'd put a title on it, on the video, that was "Hot Japanese Chick," for a joke. Then this is the earlier days of Google, when the metrics weren't so good. They only measured click-through rates. They didn't actually measure length of view rates, and particularly advertisements in the middle of YouTube. And that's why YouTube videos are getting longer, actually, because YouTube likes those videos and the algorithm faves them. But here you end up getting an email from Google saying, effectively, give us your bank account details because we noticed you've got an enormous number of views for your video, Hot Japanese Chick. Which unfortunately does say something about the quality of at least some of the people on YouTube, but also their stupidity, because YouTube's user policy, if anyone Googled "hot Japanese chick," I don't think they're going to find what they're looking for on YouTube. Duh. Okay, but the idiocy of desperation never ceases to amaze me. Okay, so eyeballs add up to money. Okay. This has presented a huge array of challenges for old media. Old media, of course, completely understood this. The economics of the newspaper, for example, literally the paper that the newspaper was printed on was around about the cost of the newspaper typically. So literally the printing, the distribution, all of the content creation, the making of news, the finding and the making of news, all had to be paid for through advertising. Of course, vast amount of advertising revenue has now gone online, and this has significantly negatively impacted on old media. Old media is still very powerful in terms of content providers, even more so in the sense that the economics of making media content are very challenging. The homemade kind of stuff you see on YouTube with YouTube is hugely successful, and that's the real amateur prosumer dynamic. But news the costs of actually collecting that are hugely expensive. And so syndication has become very powerful. That's why, for example, if you Google a news story, typically trying to get around a paywall, as I was trying to do yesterday, the Australian newspaper, owned by Rupert Murdoch, is stupidly expensive as a subscription. $500 a year I used to subscribe, and they put it up, and it's stupid. For the cost of that subscription, I can subscribe to 4 or 5 other far more interesting publications and do. So I was trying to get around the paywall. And of course, what you find is that there are so many aggregators who are sharing that site, sharing the news. And when you see a report that's actually in the public domain that is free, it is everywhere. You can find exactly the same story appearing on literally hundreds of newspaper mastheads disseminated. We find that boutique news services that used to be just behind the scenes, that were news gatherers, news effectively producers in former journalism, for media outlets that very often ran the stuff only very discreetly as having come from the wire services, Reuters, AFP, AP, for example. The news specialist media services like Bloomberg and Nikkei have become incredibly powerful in their own right. And you go directly to Nikkei website, of course, and to Bloomberg. And a number of SILS students have done internships and gone to work in Bloomberg here in Tokyo. Actually, my first ever experience of doing a online interview for international television was with him, Bloomberg in Marunouchi, and it was very, very strange. You go down there for the interview, and you're literally, after they're being asked to wait in their funky room where they've got cut fruit and yogurt and chia and all this kind of stuff. So, and you know, funky kind of breakout room kind of space. You then get ushered into the broadcast room, and there is just a camera on a stand, and you're told to stand in front of this backdrop, and then the person leaves the room. It's actually just like getting an X-ray, and then suddenly you're talking to someone in New York or Singapore or something. And it's a very, very strange experience, and you're just simply told to watch the green dot. They haven't even bothered to set up actually a monitor so that you can see the face of the person who's interviewing you. That may have subsequently changed, but very weird experience. Anyway, the newspapers that were aggregators have really struggled in terms of advertising spend. And one of the interesting legal battles now is for news contents rights holders battling with the major search providers, particularly Google, trying to force Google to give them a share of revenues, and they're typically going to governments to try and get them to write laws to actually force Google to give money to content producers. In terms of old media surviving, several of the major publications have managed to reinvent themselves very effectively, have good digital strategies, which really comes down to actually reasonable pricing of their subscription, maintaining respect for what they do, and effective syndication and monetizing the syndication, and paying and cultivating very good journalists. New York Times, hugely successful, and New York Times salaries, journalists there, many of them kind of mid-career or often quite younger people have made it in social media, for example, and then moved to New York Times. People are earning from $100,000 in the New York Times on the journalism side. One of the interesting discussions is whether the New York Times will be the only major news source to survive other than the specialist services such as Bloomberg. Obviously, the Washington Post and the LA Times and some of the others are trying to be more like New York Times. A lot of startup services like Crikey and others, we're seeing acquisition processes or them losing many of their most influential writers to organizations like the New York Times who can afford to pay. One of the basic dilemmas for old media companies is there is this universal recognition that sharing is just fundamental. People share content, but this clashes with the pay-to-view business models. And you would have experienced this, I think, routinely. You read something interesting, you share it to a friend, but they can't get beyond the paywall. And so we seem to spend an enormous amount of time actually, if you've got the subscription, PDFing things that you really want to share with friends. In an earlier period, some of the news companies didn't have paywalls. They hoped that the shares would massively increase eyeballs, traffic to their site, and that they would be able to live off advertising revenues. It seems that they've realized that there is a fairly inelastic demand amongst core readership, particularly for regional publications, and that they would rather go towards an expensive paywall and have a smaller cohort of readers rather than live with the uncertainties of traffic coming through shared links. And some of the quality publications are very afraid of that because they're really worried that it drives them to be more sensationalist, that the headlines to drive the casual share traffic is unstable. It cheapens what they do. And they will always lose out to far more sensationalist people in terms of a race to the bottom. Okay, so what we're seeing, of course, is that the business media give firms a whole lot of close scrutiny. So the survival of media itself is quite important. And the financial returns to investors who can get the latest information on what's happening with a company means that anyone who's a serious investor must have media subscriptions. So you must be subscribing, of course, to the Financial Times, to Bloomberg, all of these things that allow you to see the latest developments. But also social media is hugely significant. A lot of day traders are very active in at least monitoring Twitter and Twitter feeds where people are sharing links and stories. But also the regulators have been catching up with this, and we'll talk about this next week, these duty of disclosure to update the market very quickly. So firms are constantly having to pay attention to a much shortened news cycle, and scandals, critical reactions from consumers to announcements from companies, for example, create huge presses. So there's real dilemma for companies in the corporate communications function, because compliance issues have never been more serious. You really have to be alert to the regulators, and you can cop very heavy penalties. And we're seeing increasingly the EU and the US authorities, Securities and Exchange Commission, Fair Trade Commission, and whatnot, very quick to levy heavy fines against companies these days for misleading communications. And at the same time, social media and the shortened media cycle put pressure on companies to constantly be updating and managing their interactions with stakeholders. It's very common now for press conferences for them to be live streamed, and large numbers of media services will do this. You can go online and you can find the recorded video of Carlos Ghosn's live streamed press conference from Beirut in Lebanon after he escaped from Japan, for example. I actually watched it in the middle of the night with the time difference. It was really, really quite interesting. The huge media clamor. And actually what was quite sobering was, well, first of all, how much of Japanese media got left out in the street in Beirut. They very selectively decided who they would let in and didn't. And a lot of people got indignant. Don't they know who we are for Fuji? Yeah, no, you're in the street. And it's raining too bad. So they cherry picked who was going to be there, but also to a remarkable degree how the Japanese media just didn't send the right people who could function at the time. And there's a really cringeful moment where Carlos Ghosn picked out a Japanese journalist. Carlos Ghosn did his interview and his Q&A flip-flopping just very comfortably between native Arabic, French, and superb English. And then in the middle of the press conference, he pointed to the Japanese journalist, and the Japanese journalist said, "Oh, Nihongo de yoroshin desu ka?" And everyone in the room just laughed at him. And they're like, "Well, huh?" And Carlos Ghosn said, "No, not if you want an answer." And it was this kind of a cringeful moment. It's like, why didn't they send someone who actually had the ability to actually function there in the live context to ask the questions that they wanted to ask? By the way, there was a young journo from a lesser publication who did a superb job there. Hopefully he was a SILS graduate, but I don't think he was. Okay, so generally the whole shift is from bought media to earned media. This is just a key theme in corporate communications. Instead of just buying advertising, um, if you do, it's more online advertising, so it's more targeted messages. So you're getting it to the right people in the right place. Okay, very much based on their viewing habits. This optimization of advertising. Facebook gives you these annoying options these days with the confusing new interface too, which says, do you want optimized advertising? The alternative being, do you want just random advertising, which is even more annoying because it's less likely to mirror your interests, okay? And of course, the other approach, and we talked about this earlier on in the course, is the creation of content or corporate activities that earn the attention of mainstream and social media. Now, those of you who get your media through things like the Yahoo top page in Japan now, so free aggregation services, you would know that particularly with the kind of stay-at-home phenomena, social distancing, there are far fewer corporate events happening. There are also far fewer people agreeing to interviews. Many more journalists are looking to write stories, not wandering far from home or even leaving home. So there's a heck of a lot of content which just looks like press releases written up directly, thinly disguised spin straight from companies. The other thing too is that media outlets are more and more using cheap freelance writers. So I don't know about yourselves, but when I do look at Japanese news, it seems to me about half of them are stories about the latest product, which is supposedly hugely popular at the local kombini. So I'm sure some free writer is getting paid sanzen or whatever has wandered down to Famima, looked around and said, and kind of written it up, spinned it like there is some buzz happening, and got paid a pittance to create content. Okay. So one of the problems is the proliferation of content, and new content has to compete with the entire back catalogue of human culture. This is what makes YouTube such an astonishing thing, of course. Also, a huge array of historical records, public and private, are now digitized. A lot of family mysteries are being solved because people can Google records and connect. I won't go into the full extent of the petty intergenerational scandals on all branches of my family, but I'd say in the last 10 years with the digitization of documents, my family tree has grown a whole bunch of branches that we didn't know they exist, particularly several miscreant ancestors who were created whole parallel kind of families and had one, abandoned them, took off to Australia, had an entire new family, and then suddenly you get contacted in 2014 saying, hi, any chance that we're related? Through 5 chains of relatives, okay? So those of you who live perpetually in the mode of Googling things whenever a topic comes up for conversation, you know that search is critical to making sense of the deluge of information and cultural riches. By the way, a little bit of advice and a topic to follow on from this, we may or may not cover it, otherwise we'll cover it next week, in terms of personal communications and persuasiveness and whatnot. Don't be one of these people who Googles everything as soon as someone mentions it. Someone, hesitates for a moment on a detail, not sure when it was, and that person is just constantly, it was here, Yeah, any idiot can Google. Get this tattooed on you. Any idiot can Google. There is nothing more annoying in a team meeting, for example, than the We've got their laptop there, tapping away, constantly Googling, checking everything that everyone says. That is extraordinarily annoying to everyone else because everyone knows how to Google. One participates in the conversation and then, if necessary, follow up with the conversation. Anyway, through search, data matching, reanalysis, what we can see that we can check the narratives that people and organizations maintain about themselves in the world. You can really interrogate them. Simply, if you bullshit, it's so much easier to get caught out. One of the wisest bit of advice I've ever heard is from a dear friend of mine. We used to teach together. He's gone on to be hugely successful career-wise, Deputy Vice Chancellor of a university in Australia. His line's always simple, is very simple. Always have a story. Always test your story, walk through your story, interrogate your own story, go forward and backwards through your story, but never forget your story is just a story. Someone puts you on the spot, be ready with a story. But when your story is no longer useful or in serious danger of being shown to be just a story and not truth, abandon it and get a better story. The problem is a lot of people are too quick to believe their own story. Donald Trump, exhibit number one. Narcissists are particularly bad at this. Narcissists are incredibly persuasive to themselves, which makes them persuasive towards other people in the short term. Eventually, over time, the stories don't add up and you do get caught out. I will never forget when I was working in a university in Australia and my boss, the head of school, came rushing into the staff room, F. I'm like, oh, Gordon, what's wrong? What's annoyed you? And he said, oh, that bastard. I'm like, what? He was Canadian, but he'd been at the LSE doing his PhD with someone who never finished his PhD. But Gordon had just read on a Canadian news site that the guy had been promoted to a very significant public role and he was using the title doctor, and it was reported that he had a PhD from the LSE. Well, anyway, Gordon from Australia fired off a quick email, and within about 48 hours, the guy was publicly humiliated, lost his job, lost his career, because he'd been telling people for so long in a pre-digital age that he'd done a PhD at LSE, that he used to say he'd done doctoral studies, but he hadn't finished. And then along the way, the story kind of morphed and he believed it and he forgot that it wasn't true. Then eventually he got caught out. So in our digital age, the past you is never going to be the past, okay? It pops up just as fresh as it was the day you allowed your friend to picture you throwing it up on his cat at a party and put it on social media. Very bad look. So the first thing you need to do is to look at your digital footprints and clean them up, okay? And be alert to the fact, though, that people will have thought, oh man, that is so gross. And they will probably have screenshotted it and saved it somewhere. So don't deny it. By all means, try and clean up your ugly digital past, but do not assume that it is hidden forever, because actually there are some cool caches where you can go, if you know how to do it, recover content which has subsequently been taken down, but which is still there. More and more journalists do this, and this is something I'm going to finish up with a conversation about next week, in terms of cancel culture and this kind of almost interrogative process of trying to discover that people have a past, and particularly for political purposes or self-promotion purposes, to make people suffer for their past. We're seeing this in relation to Joe Biden, quite valuably, I think, seeing it in relation to Donald Trump as well. Right now, people don't need to do this with social media and search, because his own niece is doing that very publicly with one of the best-selling books in America right now. So gatekeepers, I think we all understand the importance of the gatekeepers. Traditionally, they were a very privileged minority in old media. This was because the old media channels were costly, scarce, and empowered a few editors, managers, few content producers, the rights holders, and the media owners. We still kind of half like to see these scary people. A lot of people are in awe of Anna Wintour, editor of New York Vogue, for example. The stylized version of her is in The Devil Wears Prada, played by Glenn Close. The novel was based on actually someone who was journalism. She did a journalism degree, and she was actually, she worked as the assistant to Anna Wintour. Couldn't write a warts and all tale, instead wrote a novel. and then it became the movie. So, you know, the whole Who's Got Talent genre there, or even the Master Chef and all the rest of it, we kind of do like the spectacle of the arrogant, grumpy person who sits back and, you know, just wants to gong someone off the stage, but then is won around by their talent and reluctantly concedes that someone actually has talent. So we kind of do savor the persona of the gatekeeper, but with our digital media and social media platforms, we have a huge array of new gatekeepers, greater competition amongst them, new arbiters of taste based on their taste, their charisma, their timelessness, and their affordance with a certain audience. And they can come from unexpected places. A very significant fashion blogger, for example, came out of the Philippines, had never been to America, for example, but had developed a huge following. Then, of course, the major brands brought the person to the shows. So new critics, curators are influencers of taste, but they're not dictators of taste. The sartorialist is a particularly interesting one, but there's a huge array of others. If you don't know it already, this started a very interesting character. He is a street photographer, and he was doing Street Snap, okay, Scott Schumann. The idea of creating a two-way dialogue about the world of fashion and its relationship to daily life. So walks the streets, literally taking pictures of people with good style and posting them. And he did a whole lot of work for GQ and other magazines, and now several analog, beautiful coffee table books and whatnot that have been done. Okay, and a very eclectic sensibility. He looks to find people have real style. He doesn't just let the monetizing opportunities of the existing brands drive it. So this guy here, you know, fantastic style in Milan. And actually the suit he's wearing was his, I think, father's or grandfather's, which he had restored. So great sense of style. We see here, of course, the book publication and collaboration. We have seen a bunch of entrepreneurs who have had a huge impact in creating new media. And Monocle magazine, in particular Tyler Brule, shows that there is still a place for print media, and it very often can't resist the temptation to cross over into brand endorsements and the select store space and whatnot. So there is a Monocle store here in Tokyo. There was it was a wonderful Monocle cafe in bottom of Lumine next to Hankyu Men's in Yurakucho. And Hankyu and I don't know, very, very bad business negotiations. And I think they tried to gouge them. And so Monocle moved out, which was unfortunate because you could have very good food and read all the magazines. And they also had a bit of shop space there. Tyler Brule, he went to one of the lowest ranked universities in Canada, then went on a working holiday to Britain, somehow talked his way into a job in the BBC, in a lowly job, then talked his way into being a stringer. He entered into an arrangement to go to Afghanistan to be a reporter for BBC, and he was shot twice in one incident, spent months lying in hospital, and then he created the magazine Wallpaper, because he said that generally interior design magazines were pretty ugly, and they had they were just full of advertisements and not very interesting, say, social and political content. So he created Wallpaper, and that was successful. He sold it. He had a non-compete provision when he sold it, so he wasn't able to create a new magazine straight away. So his branding and place branding consultancy, Wink Creative, which is run out of London, out of a building he called Midori House, because he particularly likes Japan. So that's a significant business. And then he created Monocle magazine. And it's kind of the Bible for people like you guys, cosmopolitan, mobile, well, until COVID-19, elites, okay? So they have their own radio station and a whole bunch of things streaming. But effectively, you can see that there is still a place for the quality media. So of course, Celebrity Day, we understand there's new paths to celebrity, skipping old gatekeepers, but also at the same time, almost ironically, amplifying the power of celebrity. So whole genres of not just being Kim Kardashian, but actually getting lots of follows to say, I live like Kim Kardashian for a week. Great. Okay. Well, some people like it. So anyway, getting attention. Andy Warhol very famously said, everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame. By the way, when I took a picture of this is actually Madame Tussauds in London, I realized Andy Warhol was wearing my glasses. Okay, you might notice, see exactly the same. They are Moscot glasses from New York. And then I realized the funny way that taste works, that I guess for decades I knew about Andy Warhol and I'd seen pictures, and deep down psychologically, I must have liked his glasses. So that actually when I went to the Moscot shop and thought, yeah, them, I bought them, I had no consciousness that Andy Warhol wore these glasses. And it's only when I was digging around for this picture and pulled it out, and I thought, oh, God, everyone thinks I've got Andy Warhol's glasses on, but no, he's got mine, even though he died before me, before I even bought them. Okay, attention seeking. All media, of course, increasingly battle to get the attention of people to buy media, print media. So cover design becomes hugely important. Creating buzz, and particularly buzz through social media, and in time has moved towards a digital distribution strategy. This actually was a quite serious, interesting article, attachment parenting, and how long do you breastfeed for and whatnot. And it's quite an interesting phenomenon. So insofar as there was criticism that the cover was cheapening the issue, well, that gets buzz. The criticism gets more buzz. Buzz is buzz. And then suddenly it's a news story in its own right. And people buy for the first time in maybe years, Time magazine. Now, Benetton has been confronting people for a very long time with its images. And I'm not going to go into a discussion on that now, but just encourage you to look at the links online that relate to that. I just want to remind us that although there is this expression in English, any publicity is good publicity, we do know that with the current phenomena of cancel culture, of social media pylons, of the new digital stigmatization of people, that no, it's not the case that any publicity is good publicity. And the most sobering book I mentioned once already, John Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed, his interviews with people who had lost their jobs because of a careless tweet, for example, showed that no, they didn't regularly, routinely recover, that they'd suffered enormously. So I just threw a whole bunch of words in here together, okay? The Italian notion of gravitas, of weight from gravity, gravitas, we use it in English as well, but originally from Italian, originally from Latin behind that. So the sense of dignity or weightiness, to have gravitas, as opposed to just the cheap pursuit of attention, being loud and trashy. It's often said amongst Italians that teenagers in your 20s, it's attention, and when you get into your 30s and 40s, it's all about gravitas. And so that there is this quite dramatic shift in terms of one's individual persona as one actually becomes an adult in the Italian context. You're kind of loud, mucking around, playful in your teens and early 20s, but then you'll have to develop a very dignified posture subsequently. And I think a wonderful expression from Italian, it can make us a little bit too vain, a little bit obsessive about how we're perceived, but this notion of brutta figura, which is in the middle of the list here, of a brutal figure, of looking ugly, of looking gormless, or of making a fool of yourself in public. So in terms of just getting attention, the danger of a cheap trick, and you'll sometimes hear the expression of someone will say that's very low rent, that you're really going, you're just acting in a really tacky or a cheap kind of way to get attention. And in terms of virtual signaling, for example, just criticizing other people for some faux pas, for some slip in terms of the use of language, maybe it's not, say, politically correct, and then signaling, oh, that aren't I a good person because I'm attacking someone else for not being a good person, that's a pretty low rent kind of way to draw attention to yourself. And although many on the right dismiss any social concerns as just virtue signaling, I think that is still a potent criticism of the more shallow inclination of some people to just simply use social media to make themselves look good. Okay. So I'm just checking over on chat. Okay, some things I'll follow up there. Right. Okay, so what we've seen, of course, with social media and the media in general, the tendency towards scaremongering to get attention, to generate buzz, this can be ugly. There will be very interesting debates after COVID-19 and lockdown and whatnot about whether initial responses in some countries were too severe based on the dramatic images that were coming out of particularly northern Italy. Bergamo, by the way, is a beautiful town, and it's just a real tragedy that Bergamo was hit so hard there with a cluster just north of Milan. Whether those images caused a too severe lockdown, which therefore made people resistant to a second round of restrictions. And so when there was liberalization, we now have, in a sense, a perpetual dynamic of a rising wave, not perpetual, but longer term dynamic of a rising wave, and a difficulty to return. The downside, of course, is when people think it's all over, it's all done, go, we are now post-COVID, we see the absolute tragedy of what's been happening in the United States, even Israel, which were an incredibly strict lockdown, has had a real surge, and Melbourne in Australia is in quite a bad way as well. So there'll be a lot of debates about communications. One of the videos online talks about how breaking through, getting attention for your brand and whatnot. One of the interesting ways with social media, of course, we understand, some of you will remember about 10 years ago, this trend of planking, of just striking an incongruous pose and taking an interesting picture. By the way, that was my young son. He planked all over Paris. we created a Paris planking collection at the time. I should embarrass him with these. Okay, this is him behaving badly in the Louvre, in front of absolutely magnificent Assyrian sculptures. Okay, but there's a little bit of a history of this images. This one was actually accidental. This is a poster literally on my wall. This is David Ben-Gurion, the founding Prime Minister of Israel. He was into a certain exercise regime. It's very well respected amongst experts, actually. And one thing that was encouraged was to increase circulation, to stand on your head. So he used to go for a swim in the mornings and he'd stand on his head. And then a photographer snapped a picture of the Prime Minister in his daggy swimwear standing on his head. And later a journalist asked him, why do you stand on your head? And this is the thing about having a story. He knew he'd been photographed. So he very quickly and very famously replied, I stand on my head so the state of Israel can stand on its feet. Okay, so what could have been a kind of an embarrassing thing, or he could have complained about an invasion of privacy, he instead thought of a very quick one-liner. And actually the poster I have, it has the subtitle in English, headstand for state of Israel, and then in Hebrew it's got the I stand on my head so that Israel can stand on its feet. So always have a story. Okay, it helps to be able to laugh at yourself. I think if there's one thing that I'm thankful for growing up, and there's a lot of things I'm thankful for growing up in Australia, because there's a lot of places that I wouldn't have wanted to grow up in. But one of the things that is good about growing up in Australia is that, for better and worse, Australia does not allow you to take yourself very seriously. Australians can be quite cruel in taking the piss out of each other. But you do learn at a young age that the best coping mechanism is to turn all your own disasters into stories. And whenever you screw up, you just think, when you're with friends, you're like, oh, mate, you will not believe what I did today, mate. I've eclipsed myself. I've achieved a new pinnacle of bloody useless, gormless Chris, and then share your disastrous tales. And it's like, oh, no, it's nothing, mate. Oh, you should have seen what I done. And so people love to share tales of their own ineptness, which actually is kind of useful because it becomes very difficult to take yourself too seriously. The flip side of this is that in a number of societies, anyone who does take themselves seriously gets mercilessly mocked, okay? So if you set yourself up to be parodied in some societies, you will, okay? Now, you may end up having earned media of the worst kind, okay? But perhaps you can cleverly use this, okay? If you set yourself up to be parodied, because you do get buzz from this. So any pretentious or humorless advertising makes you very vulnerable to painful parody, okay? And it may hasten the life cycle, the end of a communicative style. And we saw this earlier on in the course. Fry and Laurie's response to Calvin Klein when they, the Obsession commercials, when they did the parody of that on their very popular English TV show. So Pretension by Fry and Laurie, that just killed it for Calvin Klein as a consequence. So creating a buzz, speculative or excited talk or attention relating especially to a new or forthcoming event, okay? Someone got chopped off there, sorry about that. Anyway, the quotes are there. So face-to-face interactions in cultural, industrial, and scientific clusters have been really, really well understood as important as a social foundation of creativity. It's why people still come together in academic conferences. It's why we still see IT, which allows us to collaborate virtually, but clustering in places like San Francisco and San Diego now. Actually, Zoom's out of San Diego, for example. So still the face-to-face does matter. And it's easier to collaborate with people virtually when you actually have met them face-to-face as well, too. It's not absolutely necessary, but you do get a higher level of potential empathy, okay? And what we know is interesting studies that the most global cities are actually highly localized. And there's interesting questions of buzz around networks and learning processes, and then the pipelines that transmit ideas from clusters to a wide audience. And that particular article, I think, makes a nice distinction on that, that some of the pipelines are very one-way still, okay? But you get buzz in communities of experts, for example, which then travel through these pipelines to a much larger audience, okay? Whole bunch of interesting aspects around face-to-face. I'll just quickly zoom through this. Yeah, there's high frequency, rapid feedback, visual cues. We get this interacting by email, especially if people are not very nuanced in their expression, or even worse, in their reading, that it can be incredibly inefficient. Just the body language of people is very significant. I think we're going to use virtual communications much more, but I also think that the onus will be on webcam makers, on all hardware providers to have very high quality cameras, because there is a vast difference in being able to discern all those little muscular twitches and whatnot. Little babies are getting incredibly good, well, babies are always little people are good at reading the 100 and something different facial expressions that we have happening with a bunch of muscles moving. They have to, because they're so dependent on people. So really bad webcams simply deny us a whole lot of information about what people are really thinking, okay? In terms of socializing, there is a positive loss of anonymity. Those of you who've been into breakout rooms this semester where some people refuse to put on their camera, you've got your camera on, they don't put their camera on. That's really, really weird. It's like someone is on a dark night peering in at you through a crack in the wall, or peering through your curtains. You can't see them, but you know they can see you. Obviously, that's hugely problematic. Okay, so there's a lot of this kind of rush, excitement, and motivation that comes about. This cascade effect when you're sharing ideas and think, yeah, that would work. Oh, we could do this, and we could do this, and this, and this. And actually, you can get a massive acceleration of understanding about the potential with a new idea, particularly say in a design thinking process through communications. And the mere act of actually having to type can slow down that rush. And that rush can lead too far, but that's always a good thing. You go too far and then you pull back again. So that ideating, brainstorming kind of thing, at very least, needs a virtual face-to-face to work. Yeah, but there's a long history of businesses that have actually been built off face-to-face, not necessarily buzz per se, but word of mouth. This is Tupperware. I don't know if any of you have seen your mum having to, maybe through social obligation, participate in a Tupperware party, an American company which understood that you could turn housewives into effectively sales agents through incentivizing them to sell, to hold Tupperware parties and then to sell the product. And so people go to each other's Tupperware parties and feel obligated to buy some stuff, okay? Combination of IKEA and 100 yen stores have largely killed the business, but anyway. But it actually still exists. It still is out there. And the Party Inspiration Center on how to organize a Tupperware party. It's actually so kind of retro 70s, in a funny kind of way. It may actually have cultural buzz again. So Amway in Japan worked in a similar kind of way. So the lessons from these businesses in the past, decades ago, have meant that there are a wide array of techniques, initiatives, and research. We're trying to figure out social interactions around products, brands, design, messages. So before digital media, this was already getting attention. But of course, digital media has made it so much more important. Before we had social media with instant shares, there was still a lot of sharing of content. It was sharing links, so stuff that would be posted on websites, and people would literally cut and paste the link. Before you could click on the browser and share the link, people would just copy and paste the link into an email and send it to friends. And I'm of an age to remember that was the initial kind of share. And so this very famous BMW initiative, featuring Clive Owen, the actor, the brilliant Taiwanese director Ang Lee, made one that I strongly recommend you watch, The Hire, online. BMW Films said, we're spending all of this money on advertising. How about we just take $1 million a piece, including the budget for lending a couple of cars and damaging them, give them to some up-and-coming filmmakers and say, make a short video. And so they did this BMW film series. You can still see the films online. Massively successful. And it effectively dealt with the problem that BMW was losing its cachet in target markets. Audi was much more dynamic. Mercedes had revamped their image and whatnot. And they really got very strong engagement with the brand. The one with the Hire featuring Clive Owen is done by Ang Lee, is seriously cool. I strongly recommend you watch it. Okay, so buzz on social media. Excuse me, let me have a sweep. Obviously, we understand this, the change scale of sharing and all the rest of it. So event design is now central to campaigns looking for this earned social media. We understand that. And sometimes this carries over to gags, April Fool's Day. This has been a bit of a genre for at least 10 years now. One of my former emissaries, she was interning at Audi here in Tokyo, and she was involved in this one. So this was Audi in Japan claiming that they had made a unique Japanese limited edition model of their car, of course, with tatami seats and all the rest of it, and a rice cooker. It was just a bit of fun. But the cool thing they did was that they gave it an analog thing, was that if you dropped in anytime in April into an Audi dealership, they gave you shamoji, so a Japanese rice spatula made with, I think it's hinoki, it's Japanese wood, and with the Audi logo on it. So just to get people to wander into the store. So kind of a fun idea. There is one I've put online, an interesting one that I'll push up so it's more prominent, that Honda did quite interestingly with the Fit, and which takes us back to our starting point here. Playful reference, well, really not taking the piss out of hipsters in New York hipsters and Brooklyn hipsters. Okay, so we started with this, so this is just a reiteration, so I'll just scroll straight through it. Of course, creating content which speaks to your core audience. became very clear, first of all, with surfing, snowboarding, skiing, cycling, and then brands that really wanted to associate themselves with those kind of activities, extreme sports. Red Bull did this. Nissan aligned its X-Trail model with an extreme snowboarding event. For a few years, actually, they were building a snowboarding huge jump in Tokyo Dome and having major events there. And then for various reasons, that stopped happening. But that was you can still see some interesting kind of cases there. There's a whole range of interesting moves by activists to use social media in a sense to kind of hijack capitalist culture. One of the impetus of this was recognizing that how viral a whole bunch of hoaxes went. And then activists realizing, well, we can actually do a similar kind of thing deliberately in this notion of kind of culture jamming, sometimes quite illegal, various things like altering billboards, hacktivism and whatnot, occupation events, guerrilla events. These days, the tables have been turned that a whole bunch of corporate event designers have looked at what the activists did and thought, oh, we can do that in a similar kind of way and get social media. And one of the most disconcerting, but one of the most effective was Islamic State, which has been now largely wiped out. But Islamic State had a really powerful sense of social media and of aesthetics. And this is particularly kind of gross. I think we know what comes of this, what came of this in the end. It was awful. And we saw the terrible case of a Japanese journalist executed in a similar fashion, also forced into the red jumpsuit, the orange jumpsuit. The orange jumpsuit was not a random choice. It was a reference to the uniforms that US authorities made prisoners in Guantanamo Bay wear. And that's where many Islamist terrorist suspects were effectively arrested abroad and taken by American forces to Guantanamo Bay and held in prison there. So they were playing with the aesthetics of this. Then, by the way, actually, then we saw in Syria, al-Nusra Front, a rival gang to Islamic State turned the tables. They dressed up in the orange overalls and beheaded a bunch of Islamic State guys on video as well, too. So in terms of social media and events, creating the buzz, I think we understand completely connecting people to conjure crowds. Some interesting cases of completely losing control of this. In terms of personal communications, I put a video there and I'll show it just in a moment, of one of the most notorious, obnoxious young Australians who had a party in his parents' house when his parents were away. And it went viral and got massively out of control, and the riot squad came, and then he was interviewed on TV and he was completely contemptuous, refusing to apologize. So you can see the guy online. He's very famous for his cheap, stupid sunglasses. It's like kind of the kid from hell. You know, you go away for the weekend and suddenly your house is overwhelmed by hundreds of people because of social media. And then it's on the national news and your son is entirely unapologetic. So he's actually gone on to be a periodic social media celebrity in Australia, which wouldn't surprise people. Okay. So there are some interesting twists on this. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced a silent gig kind of thing with streaming, that people get in a public place and everyone's listening to the same stream music and kind of dancing, which is pretty weird if you're walking by. There's some of these have been done in the tube in London and whatnot. Really quite surreal if you don't hear the sound. And it's sometimes multi-site and across borders. The flash mob phenomena, we've seen some very nice ones of these. I put one of them online. It's interesting to look at in the Spanish case. But a guy who was at Wired magazine first did this as a social experiment and with an ironic intent, and it got horribly out of control, and they turned violent actually, and there were threats of being prosecuted by the police in New York. So the typical nice modern version of this is an initially seemingly low-key event that's spontaneous, engages the passers-by, and it grows into something very significant. We saw Air France did this with some of their staff, and then the digital version of that went viral as well. So a whole range of different organizations are trying to use these notions to the point where they're actually becoming a little bit kind of cliched. And of course, COVID-19, pretty much no go. Okay, now in terms of personal communications, got some shares here. I'm going to go over and show you the guy from hell in terms of from the website. I hope you look at this yourselves. This one looks really rude. It is a parody on flirting. The thumbnail shows the rudest part of the video, but actually this is Saturday Night Live on flirting. I do recommend you look at the video though, because it's actually kind of, you all know someone who looks like this, okay? Who acts like this, they're kind of being flirtatious and then goes too far. And then there's a wonderful moment where she's, oh, I'm such a slut. And we all know someone who's been drunk like that, okay, and doing that. So guys and girls in general, very simple in terms of personal branding. Don't be a slut. Don't be a social media slut. That's the takeaway. Also, don't be a chav. Those of you with an English background will know. I put this here, Armstrong and Miller show very interesting set of parodies of contemporary youth culture and entitlement and ways of speech through the prism of the cultural construct that is the Battle of Britain movie. There's a whole genre in the 50s and 60s that showed Britain at its finest hour. The Dunkirk film kind of did that in a tasteful kind of way. I particularly like this one because it's got a uni reference. So just as a bit of a warm up, that's okay. I'll stop that. Excuse me a moment. So I'll flip over to personal communications, and as you can see, kind of half the way I'm going with that is be careful about the speech habits you pick up if you've been on study abroad or if you're hanging out with people, and particularly if you're trying to sound native, because there's a big difference between sounding like an intelligent, accomplished native and sounding like a bit of, as we would say in Australia, a bit of a dill, okay? A bit dumb. Okay, interpersonal communications in a nutshell. Okay, mindful of our time. These are some of the biggest challenges for organizations and companies that do so much to get the customer interface right in terms of their web presence, the quality of their product, and all the rest of it, can be really let down with the human dimension. I had a conversation after this class recently, and it turned out we both have a shared intense frustration with the Apple Store experience here in Tokyo. There's too many charai kikokse and skater kids who spent, and surfies who spent a little bit of working holiday time in Australia or something, I think, and seem to think that you can bro every single customer who walks in. Not a good idea. Okay, the human interface. Staff are a key touch point in making firms' reputation with clients, okay? You can have quality products and processes. You can really carefully manage the bought and earned media presence, but then be really vulnerable at the human interface between the client and the enterprise. Staff boredom, pranking, a whole range of things can lead to problems, particularly with social media when people are stupid enough to muck around and then to post it on social media. Very famous case of a Lawson franchise in Kochi back in 2013. The guy who had the franchise, he had his idiot son working, and he and his mate climbed into the freezer and with all the food, frozen food, and took pictures, and then shared it on social media. And then Lawson had to apologize, and it was devastating for the father's business. Okay. Social media risks in general. Cathay Pacific case of airline stewardess taking flirtatious, well, the flirtatious pictures were taken by her foreign pilot boyfriend, who then stupidly shared them on social media, and then sort of ended up in the front page of a really crappy newspaper. And then, of course, the company very heavy-handed in firing people. So one of the really striking things in Japan, I think, is that Japanese companies have understood the human interface and have had a very strong emphasis on scripted conversations, on making sure that the interaction between the customer and the firm pretty much is standardized. So I often say that Japan makes fantastic robots from people, that it kind of turns people into quasi-robots. If you go to work in a combi or whatever, my son had this when he worked for a little while at Famimart when he was a high school student. He shouldn't have, but anyway, that never caught him. Had to literally learn the script, and many of you will have had this experience. I find it absolutely fascinating in taxis that no matter the age of taxi driver, it's some veteran, oyaji, whatever, they always have a standard expression about not forgetting things, leaving things behind. So literally people have learnt the script. The downside with this is it becomes highly formulaic. You really can't have those conversations where you get off script and have a real human connection. That is problematic. The positive aspect in a country like mine, Australia, which just doesn't bother even trying to do this, is that insofar as if you hire friendly, cheery people, they can form genuinely warm connections with customers, and it can be very positive. But if your staff are having a bad day, the customers are going to have a really bad day as a result. So it entirely depends on the character and the mood of the staff member, and service should not be like that. Japan perhaps goes a little bit too far. On the other hand, what we do see is that Japan is extraordinarily good at using tactful communications to nudge people to better behavior. This is a sign on the back of, you'll see this in a lot of cabs, a little sign on the back seat there. So if you're feeling ill, please don't hesitate to tell the driver, okay? No. Which means if you're about to do a power vomit in your cab, well, fortunately with COVID-19, there's some plastic, so the driver it's not going to be as bad for the driver. If you get into Australia or New York cabs or whatnot, there's perspex and everything, and there's a big sign which says $800 cleaning fee or $500 cleaning fee. So if you spew in our cab, it's going to cost you. So a much more kind of subtle, unsubtle, very hard-headed approach to communications. So just a really basic point, we're right at time. I'm going to zoom through this and pick up on it just to cover a few things. I think we understand, and this is why we're doing this when the presentation is, your video is due on Thursday. It's about your personal branding, okay? Social media and more people working as free agents have made the concept influential, but you know, you have to get the product right. You have to brand yourself. It's not just about spinning, okay? Work on the expression. Okay, this here's a checklist of things not to say. Okay, I thought this is a good quote from Kylie Jenner when she was asked about her lips. She says, "I think big lips are awesome, awesome. The Grand Canyon is awesome." Okay, blah blah blah. But I don't even care anymore. I'm like, whatever. Just say whatever you want. Okay, so whatever you say, whatever, guaranteed to make you sound dumb. If you want to sound like a native speaker, listen to lots of good English. Do not use gonna, wanna, things like that. They don't make you sound native. You just sound dumb. And don't don't fake American accents. Americans will know you're faking it, and anyone who's not American will just think you're like dumb, you know. So, you know, hi, I'm Yumi from Japan. It's like, no, okay. Japanese accents are very nice, okay? Be proud of your Japanese accent. I've showed you this. Okay. There's a couple of questions about silence, because many Japanese are a little bit shy and reserved. So is silence golden? Can it make you look cool? It can do. It can work quite well. On the other hand, can you look dumb if you're suddenly caught without a story? So it's one thing to look considered and to have gravitas and reserved, but in the end, it is good to have something to say. Because actually a lot of research has shown that even though you might look strong, you're also likely to look marginal as not a key person if you're not actively participating in work conversations, for example. However, one time where I think the Japanese being comfortable with staying silent works very well is in a negotiation situation, because often people will rush to fill a silence and they will give away things they shouldn't. Check this guy out on video. Interesting take on picking up and, you know, hanging with his crew and all the rest of it, but also just incredibly good communicative capability. A little bit on body language. This is a social media thing, but I wanted to share it with you. What is it in body language? Okay. I love this. Didn't think it was possible for a stick figure to look guilty, but look at this guy. There is just something about the way this stick figure is drawn that he really did look like he started the fire, right? Okay. You can look at these yourselves in terms of body language issues and be very, very conscious of them. This is a conversation I'd like to bring back next week. I'd like to do a fine little breakout about communicative styles. And particularly we've got non-Japanese in the class, and we've got Junjapa, and we've got people who are kind of very bicultural and bilingual. How do you project confidence in Japan without being arrogant? In every society, it's this difficult balancing act between being persuasive, confident, without looking arrogant. Okay, so this is our simple little talking point that I want you to think about next week. Some tips on body language there, and we'll return to that conversation there. Finally, I just want to emphasize: be careful what you borrow. I showed that in terms of found objects. You know, that we saw the pot from the hospital in as decor in Ginza, which was pretty gross. Okay. Just an Australian one, Ugg boots. And I have seen so many classy women wearing Ugg boots. What you need to understand in the Australian context is Ugg boots are a marker of a particular super low class cultural identity from the mid to late 1980s to the point where it's actually become a social phenomena. So now there are, and we talk about bogans. So someone who's very kind of charai, suburban, sort of Yankee, Aussie 1980s Yankee version, okay? And so here, like the Bogan Bingo Artist fundraiser. So if you wear Ugg boots, don't be surprised if people look at you and think, okay, you look great until the knees down. And finally, if you want to get a sense of Bogan culture, but how you can be the most rough guy, but also become a social media hero, I've put a video online there of this guy who stopped someone running away after he crashed a car into the fish and chip shop next to his house. And he is textbook Aussie Bogan, unfortunately from my hometown of Brisbane. But have a look at the video, and if anyone insists, I can do an Aussie accent like him, but I might save that up for next week if I have to. Okay, I'll leave it there. Okay, so I'm going to hang around for a while, Q&A. Just a couple of final reminders that we have a quiz that I've going to have go live from 5 o'clock. And to give you time to do it after you finish off your videos, some of you will be finishing videos up to the last minute. So you'll want to be looking at some of that video material online, which relates to questions 9 and 10, topics 9 and 10. And so the quiz turns off 23:59 Saturday night. Okay, we'll have one more quiz next week, which will be 10%. This other one is 5%, and it'll take the form of 20 multiple choice. Up until now, they've been 20 questions, but 10 true and false and 10 multiple choice. And in the message I sent through the announcements, you can see the range of it. Don't forget, you've got your COVID communication examples as well that have to be uploaded by the end of the week, and also your personal learning log, which talks about the experience of A1 and A2. That has to be up by Monday noon next week. Okay. Both of those two things, as I said in the message I sent out earlier, they're concise. I don't need a huge amount of material, but it's just to, in the personal learning log, to get a bit of an insight into what were the key kind of learning points for you and challenges, and how you felt about the whole process on both of them. And then finally, the COVID communications, less is more. Just give me a few good examples of COVID communications and a few really bad examples. If you end up with more bad than good, that's okay, as you see it, okay? But it is a chance to share them there. And you can load them up online. The COVID communications one, you can put up to 500 meg, actually, but try not to use it if possible. Okay. Finally, there will be a peer review instrument, just to so you can give some feedback in terms of how your group dynamic worked. But I'll do that after you've done the personal learning log, because that's a good opportunity for you to sort your own thoughts on that whole process, look back over how you interacted through the forum and whatnot, and then I'll drop that peer review instrument just around the time of our final class next week. So thank you very much, folks. And I know it's a very heightened rush in this short semester now, where a lot of things are coming together. So take care of yourselves. I'll hang around now, can do till about 5 o'clock, in fact, if need be, and answer any questions you've got. So thank you.